Bonnie Friedman. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's an honor to share this family story. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." The events I want to share today are not ones that have all been agreed upon. There are, in fact, some messy inconsistencies, differences of opinion, and even disagreement about facts. Nonetheless, it is a history that I want to share. One caveat: I am not an historian. I did a fair amount of research and I verified as much as I could, but I don't claim to be an expert. So please bear with me and be forgiving if you think I got something wrong or if I get a little emotional, for this is an account of what happened at Dachau, but it is also a family story of love, loss, and heroism. I grew up in the shadow of Dachau. I'd heard the name and knew something about it before really knowing anything at all about World War II. My father, Ernie Friedman, was a liberator, a distinction he bore with great honor. But as a kid, I didn't know he was a hero, only that he saw the horrors of Dachau with his own eyes. Sadly, the pictures he took there were lost by another family member. My dad came home from the war with a fistful of medals and citations, among them a Bronze Star, Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster, a Good Conduct Medal, and a European, African, Middle Eastern Service Medal with bronze stars. Here are two of his medals alongside a newspaper clipping in which he describes the bullet wound that entered his scalp, resulting in new hair sprouting along the scar on his balding head. He wondered if the treatment he received might have some commercial value. Well, we'll never know, but the wound did bring him one of several Purple Hearts he earned in battle. More than once, he was cited for bravery under fire. One story is that prior to a battle, my dad's commanding officer assigned him the job of radio operator, even though he had not been trained as one. The commander also shared the battle plan with him. When the commander was shot and seriously wounded, my dad knew the battle plan and took over directing the troops. He gave a tank captain orders, but the captain refused to take them from a lower level soldier. So my dad called him yellow, and the captain threatened to have him court-martialed. But instead, the captain was threatened with court-martial for refusing to go into battle, and my dad was awarded a Bronze Star. My dad said he avoided making many close friends in the Army because too many people he knew were being killed. He returned home from the war with some temporary new hair and with more certainty than ever that the U.S. was the best country in the world. Over the years, he and I had some spirited conversations about that, but his resolve on the issue never wavered. And he remained resolute about the threat of anti-Semitism, not just in Europe, but also here in the US. I scoffed then at his worries about anti-Semitism in this country, but now his concerns seem prescient. Unlike many veterans, my dad talked to me from time to time about his experiences in the Army and Dachau in particular. Later, he talked to my kids about it too. His stories were always age appropriate, but one thing was clear. In our family's history, Dachau was hollow ground. One early recollection is when I was 10 and very ill. My father stayed in my room with me all night, telling me stories of his life. I do not remember all the details, But every time I woke up, he was there talking to me. One of the things he told me about was a strange place called Dachau. I knew it was important to him. Over time, I learned more about it. His focus was mostly on what happened and less on what he personally did. He was a humble man. My father tried to enlist in the Army in 1942, but at the age of 18, he was turned away because of flat feet and poor eyesight. The following year, the Army was less particular. The skinny young man with thick glasses from a small town in western Pennsylvania was drafted and placed in a division of the National Guard from Oklahoma, the 45th Infantry, best known as the Thunderbirds. Ironically, the 45th gained its nickname Thunderbirds from the gold thunderbird, a Native American symbol that became their insignia in 1939. It replaced another Native American symbol, the swastika, that had been used before, but was withdrawn when it became associated with the Nazi Party. The Thunderbirds were made up of a disparate collection of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Southwestern cowboys, and random inductees like my dad. They were one of the most diverse and integrated divisions in an otherwise very segregated army. The Thunderbirds also became known as one of the hardest fighting combat troops of the war. So, how did they get to Dachau? It's an interesting story. They weren't supposed to go there initially. To start, the division landed in Italy, then fought at Anzio, moved up the boot of Italy, and crossed through France. They broke through the Siegfried Line and entered Germany in March 1945, fought in the Battle of Nuremberg, and then were ordered to head toward Berchtesgaden with hopes of eventually capturing Hitler at his Alpine retreat. But along the way, the unit got orders to make a detour to Dachau. They had been en route to Munich, but received word that the city was already secured, so the Thunderbirds weren't needed there. So they marched toward Dachau, knowing precious little about their destination, only that it was a German work camp of some sort. At the same time, the 42nd Division, commanded by Brigadier General Henning Linden, was also headed to Dachau. In fact, the 42nd had received their orders to go there first. They weren't expecting the Thunderbirds to be there when they arrived. Dachau was the first concentration camp established by the Nazis and one of the last to be liberated. It was a work camp to start, housing about 5,000 political prisoners. Over time, its population swelled to include Jehovah's Witnesses, Romas, homosexuals, and by 1938, primarily Jews. One of its more famous prisoners was the Lutheran pastor, Martin Niemöller. You likely know him as the author of the poem beginning, "First They Came for the Socialists." Dachau also had another distinction. It was the first Nazi camp to use prisoners for medical experimentation. The GIs had no idea what awaited them, though my father said they could smell the stench of death long before they reached the camp. As word spread that the Allies were coming, German officers began fleeing the camp, leaving lower level guards in charge. When the Thunderbirds neared Dachau, They found more than 30 railroad cars filled with dead, decomposing bodies outside the gates. The stench was unbearable, but the reality they were witnessing would get even worse. Inside the camp, there were more bodies and 32,000 survivors, most severely malnourished and emaciated, many sick and some unable to stand. American soldiers reacted with anger and disbelief. Some cried, others became physically ill, and still others were unable to contain their rage. The scene near the entrance to the confinement area numbed my senses, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the commander of the Thunderbirds. He took note of the coal-fired crematorium, gas chamber, rooms piled with human corpses, and more bodies lying where they had fallen. Death was everywhere. What happened next is a matter of recorded history, but not widely known. A number of the American liberators were so outraged by what they saw, they lost control. They had been in hard battle for more than 500 days. They were physically exhausted, and emotionally, this was too much to bear. Several GIs lined up the captured German guards and machine gunned them down, execution style. It is reported that 30 to 50 SS guards were killed, but some said the numbers were far greater. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks had not ordered the attack and was not even present in the coal yard where the incident took place. But some believed he was accountable nonetheless, and Sparks was loyal to his troops and stood by them. And so Dachau was liberated. My father spoke of the horrors that the soldiers witnessed when they entered the camp and how deeply it affected him. He also said he was one of the few soldiers in his unit who spoke a little Yiddish, so he was able to communicate a bit with the prisoners. But the story of the liberation didn't end there. Remember the 42nd Division, headed by Brigadier General Henning Linden? When he arrived at the camp, he took charge. He was, after all, higher ranking and believed he was supposed to be there first. He also was accompanied by Marguerite Higgins, a well-known American journalist at the time who wanted to interview inmates, and Linden wanted the credit for liberating the camp. According to Sparks' own account, he denied the Linden party access to the compound where inmates were restless in anticipation of their freedom. He said Higgins removed the bars and sneaked through the gate, creating something of a riot inside. And now quoting from Sparks, it had already been a most trying day. I therefore requested the general and his party to leave and directed one of my men to escort them from the camp. The good general was a dandy who carried a riding crop as his badge of authority. As my man approached the jeep, the general laid a blow on the man's helmet. I then made some intemperate remarks about the general's ancestry and threatened to remove him and his party from the camp by force. He then said I was relieved of my command and he was taking charge. I then drew my pistol and repeated my request that he leave. In the end, it was Linden who accepted the Germany's surrender. At Dachau, he and his troops were credited with the liberation. Felix Sparks and several of his troops, on the other hand, faced a court-martial for what had happened in the coal yard of Dachau. It was not the first time that Sparks had crossed swords with a higher-ranking officer, and Lyndon, who pressed for the court-martial, was intent on getting recognition for the liberation. So Sparks was ordered to appear before General George Patton, who had recently been appointed military governor of Bavaria. Patton reportedly told him, "I have already had these charges investigated, and they are a bunch of crap. I'm going to tear them up, and you and your men have no record that this ever happened." He dismissed all the charges and called the Thunderbirds one of the best, if not the best, division in the history of American arms. And he told Sparks, "Don't let the scars ruin you." My father's account. Meanwhile, my father came home from the war believing that the Thunderbirds were not credited with the liberation of Dachau. He moved on with his life, but was always disappointed and saddened by lack of recognition for the Thunderbirds. He was there, he knew what happened, though he never mentioned the coal yard execution of Nazi guards, and I'll never know what exactly he knew or didn't know about it. He's shown here on the far left with some of his army buddies after the war. My father did tell me of one horrible incident that had happened. U.S. troops had shot a German guard in the leg, and when he couldn't get away, the troops allowed prisoners to beat him to death with shovels. He also told us that the Thunderbirds liberated the camp and then were ordered to stand aside and allow a division from New York to march through and get all the credit. My dad and his fellow soldiers believed it was because New York had more clout than Oklahoma. Lyndon's troops, the 42nd, were in fact a division of the New York National Guard, and at Dachau, they certainly got the credit. Many years later, my father told our son Adam that serving in the war and liberating Dachau were awful experiences. He was glad he did it, but he would never want to do it again. And he never wanted his children or grandchildren to go through what he did. My dad also left something important behind. He lost his faith at Dachau. Raised a practicing, observant Jew, he said he could no longer believe in a God who would allow something like that to happen. He remained committed to the practices and traditions of Judaism, but he had lost his faith forever. The Holocaust Museum. Over the years, I occasionally heard my dad's stories about the war in Dachau, and as our kids grew up, they heard some of his stories too. Nothing ever changed in his retelling of what had happened there. Then, in the mid-1990s, my husband and I went to visit the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington soon after its opening. We toured the exhibits and took in the horrors of the concentration camps. We ended our tour in front of the display of the flags of the liberators in the lobby of the museum. And there, to my amazement, hung the Thunderbirds flag. It took my breath away. The Thunderbirds were recognized as liberators of Dachau. My husband and I were able to talk with a docent, and I told him my father's story about being ordered to step aside because a division from New York was going to get all the credit. The docent checked the military records and came back telling us there was a New York unit that marched through, but they were on their way to another battle, and the Thunderbirds were credited as liberators of the camp. I could not wait to get home and call my dad and tell him of our amazing find. The next time he came to visit us, he and I went to the museum together. My dad was declining and walking wasn't easy, but we went through every step of the museum. All the while, he narrated the story of World War II, the Holocaust, and of course, Dachau. I wish I had recorded it all, but I did not. So I am left with the emotions, chiefly the immense pride in my father's role as a liberator of Dachau. Tears rolled down my cheeks as we stood together in the lobby of the museum, taking in the view of the Thunderbird flag among those of all the other liberators. At the museum, both the 42nd and 45th Divisions are recognized as liberators of Dachau. It still is not clear to me if the New York troops that marched through, pushing the Thunderbirds aside, were the 42nd or another unit, as the docent explained. But either way, the Thunderbirds had been denied their place in history, at least at the camp. I was thrilled, of course, that they were recognized at the Holocaust Museum. Visiting Dachau. Several years ago, my husband Bob and I planned a trip to Europe. We decided to start our journey in Munich so we could visit Dachau. My father had died many years before. We could not discuss our plans with him. I didn't know how he would have reacted to our going. After all, he had vowed never to step foot in Germany again. Moreover, he would never knowingly buy a German product and had been quite upset when I got a VW years and years before. He never had anything good to say about Germany or the German people. Like many of his generation, he carried the scars of the war that way. When I was young, I had a school friend whose parents were German. When my father found out her mother was from one of the camps near Dachau, he engaged her in a conversation. About the camp, she said, they had no idea what was going on there. My father was upset by the conversation. While he was not confrontational, I got a clear, unspoken message. He was not happy with my friendship, and slowly it waned. But that was all years ago, and I wanted to visit Dachau, the camp that had been casting a long shadow for as long as I could remember. We landed in Munich and had dinner with Bob's nephew and his wife, who were living not far from there. His nephew was stationed in the army, and they met us at the airport. It was a fitting welcome to our journey. The next day, we took a train from Munich to the little town of Dachau, and then a bus to the camp. Our tour guide was fascinated with the stories of my dad's experience in the war. He knew the liberation of Dachau was credited to the 42nd. He did not know about the Thunderbirds. I told him all I could recall. Our tour was informative, but not entirely what I expected. The camp had been sanitized. The horrors had been cleared up and cleaned up. The barrack-style bunks had all been rebuilt. There were stories of what had happened there, but not much evidence, it seemed. As we walked through the camp, I slowed my pace and started becoming aware of a presence. It was as if my dad were with me, just above my left shoulder, close and comforting, guiding me along the way. And then I knew he was glad I was there. His story and mine had come together in that place and time. The tour group walked to the back of the camp, where our guide told us the ovens and the gas chamber were hidden from view. During the war, the Nazis had not wanted visitors to the camp to see them. They had built Dachau as a model work camp, not a concentration camp where people were cruelly experimented on, killed in ovens, and gassed to death. Our tour took us past the ovens. It was hard to look and equally hard to look away. And then we came to the gas chamber and we were invited to step inside if we wished. I did, and that's where I just lost it. Standing there was wrenching. It was one thing to file past recreated barracks made to look like those where the prisoners had been crowded in lice and rat-infested bunks. It was difficult to walk past the ovens where the Jews had been cremated. But for me, it was quite another thing to step inside a gas chamber that had been not altered since 1945. The memorial outside the gas chamber reads, "Never forget how we died." That message is powerful. If you've been to a concentration camp, then you know. There are no words adequate to describe it. All the horrors of the war and the history of the Jews were encapsulated for me in that one now barren, horrific space. As we left the camp, we paused to view the plaque attributing the liberation of Dachau to the 42nd Division of the New York National Guard. But I knew that wasn't the real story. We stopped in the gift shop because I wanted a history book as a souvenir. We lost track of time and missed our bus, and with it, our train back to Munich. We figured out how to get back, but for a moment or two, it was as if we didn't want to leave. Dachau's long shadow held me for a few minutes more. And a postscript. My father's story of Dachau has flowed through me all my life, usually in the background, but occasionally front and center. And it's been transmitted to our children as well. When our son Adam traveled to Italy a few years ago, he purposely planned his itinerary to include a visit to Anzio, where he knew his Zadie, that's Yiddish for grandfather, had fought in World War II. Our daughter Rachel recently investigated stories of the role that Black soldiers called the Panthers had played in the liberation of Dachau. It is not well documented, but there is some evidence they may have been involved. One liberated prisoner recalled seeing Black soldiers among the American troops. I called this history a family story of love, loss, and heroism. The love, I believe, is apparent, as is the loss of the full history, my dad's photos, and more importantly, his faith. We lost my dad in 2004. We've been able to put together much of his story, but pieces are missing, and we don't have access to records that might have helped fill in the blanks. In 1973, there was a massive fire at the National Archives facility for military personnel records outside St. Louis. The fire destroyed between 16 and 18 million military records, including 80% of the records of U.S. Army personnel discharged between 1912 and 1960, my dad's records among them. The cause of the fire, which burned for 22 hours, was debated, but we know for certain it left enormous loss in its wake. Recently, our son was able to retrieve what could be reconstructed of his Zadie's service from the National Personnel Records Center. So we have some documentation. But for me, one of the greatest losses is that I didn't record my father's recounting of our tour together through the Holocaust Museum. What I wouldn't give to have that now. The liberation of Dachau remains a controversial story. The execution of German guards, should there have been court-martials, which unit is officially credited with liberation? Were Black soldiers involved, but not fairly credited? One thing is certain, though, there were heroes at Dachau, American troops who liberated the camp on April 29, 1945, freeing 32,000 prisoners on that day. And in our family, Corporal Ernie Friedman certainly ranks among them. He came home, met and married my mother, Marie. He went to college and they bought a house on the GI Bill. He went into the insurance and real estate business and together with my mother raised two daughters, my sister Debbie and me. You can see my father on the left with his sister Molly and then fiance Marie. And on the right, there's a family photo of our vacation in Atlantic City. My parents welcomed three grandchildren, Rachel, Adam, and Jenna. You can see them all here. Later, my father sold his business and retired. My parents moved to Florida, but later returned to live in Pittsburgh. Sadly, they didn't live to see their great-grandson, Aaron, who was born in 2020 and was named for my dad, helping to ensure that his memory lives on. In Hebrew, we say, Lador, Vador, from generation to generation. That is my family story of love, loss, and heroism. Thank you for joining me. It was a pleasure and an honor to share my family's story with you.